Shabbat Shalom. This week's portion is Va'era, and in this week's portion we have the description of 7 out of the 10 plagues of Egypt. What I would like to focus on today is trying to get a perspective on the relationship, the growing relationship between Moses and the children of Israel. We saw already in last week's portion, after God first spoke to Moses and designated him as the representative of the people and of God to go to Pharaoh, Moses in fact goes to the children of Israel, tells him about his mission, and shows them, he and Aaron show them some signs, and we see in chapter 4, verse 31, that the nation trusts, believes what Moses has to say, and believes that indeed God has remembered the children of Israel. Things begin to unravel later on. And Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh for the first time, and we see now in this week's portion, in chapter 6, verses 6 through 9, after Moses has left Pharaoh's palace for the first time, Pharaoh is very angry and immediately makes the circumstances of the slavery much more difficult. And at that point, God speaks to Moses and tells him to go to the children of Israel and give them the promises of redemption. And in fact, the verses are very, very, very dramatic and very exciting. Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of Egypt, and I will deliver you out of their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments, and I will take you to me for a people, and I will be to you a God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brings you out from under the burdens of Egypt, and I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you for a heritage. I am the Lord. But what is the concluding verse of this section? And Moses spoke so to the children of Israel, but they hearkened not to Moses, for anguish of spirit and for cruel bondage. Here we have, after the situations become so difficult, the children of Israel are no longer able to listen to anything that Moses says. When does this situation change? And indeed it does. First of all, we have a very interesting section further on in that same chapter, in chapter 6, verse 13. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and gave them a charge to the children of Israel and to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. And what's the very next verse? It's a very puzzling verse, actually. These are the heads of their fathers' houses, the son of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, etc. We begin with a list of the lineage of the first 3 children of Jacob, of Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. And our sages have asked, quite logically, what does this have to do with anything? Why do we suddenly have a list of lineage, and it's not even an entire lineage? It's only of the first 3 families. There is a midrash that says that God actually commanded Moses that they should, as part of this giving the charge to the children of Israel, they should do this by going directly to the individual leaders of the tribes, beginning with the older brothers, beginning with the descendants of Reuben, and then Simeon and Levi, and speak to them individually. Actually, this is a very important tactic, because initially we see Aaron and Moses speaking to the children of Israel, to an audience, a very large audience. And then when things get bad, of course, they are so downtrodden that they are unable to listen to anything Moses and Aaron said. So here we have a completely different approach. We have God commanding that they should go individually, person by person. Now, I read a very interesting article that analyzes both these verses and this particular midrash and says something very interesting. The list of lineage stops after Levi. And the conclusion that this article draws is that Moses actually failed in his mission. He thought this would be the best way to communicate with the children of Israel. The lecture to the masses didn't work. Let's try talking to the individual family leaders. But after doing this with 3 different families, and it failed, for that reason, we do not have a continuation of the lineage. However, the story continues. And we see in our next week's portion, in chapter 10, after there have already been 7 very, very difficult plagues, that we have chapter 10, God reveals a slightly different motivation in bringing all of these plagues. Until now, we have seen the plagues as being punishments to Egypt and a way of forcing Egypt to release the children of Israel. But here we have a new motivation. That you may tell in the ears of your son and of your son's son what things I have done in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord, and Moses and Aaron, king, etc. In other words, we have here a commandment that Moses and Aaron are giving to the children of Israel, not just so that the current generation will understand God's greatness, but that right now we are already setting the seeds for a generational telling of this great story. And I think if we put this entire picture together, we can come up with a very interesting message. Speaking to the masses doesn't work. Speaking to the individual leadership of the families in an attempt to create personal relationships, well, it's a start. But it probably didn't work that well either. However, at the conclusion of 7 plagues, where there was already a very drawn-out process, where the Egyptians and the children of Israel were already able to see God's hand over and over again. Add to that the understanding that the children of Israel are standing there as witness with the responsibility to communicate onward to their generations, to their progeny. At that point, they are able to listen, because they know they are not just listening for themselves, but they're listening in order to transmit. And later on, of course, we see in Exodus chapter 12, verse 28, and again in verse 35, that the children of Israel do exactly as they have been commanded by Moses. We don't see any more. First of all, it's the first time in chapter 12 where again Moses comes back and speaks to the children of Israel. Whereas previously in chapter 6, the children of Israel are unable to listen to what Moses has to say. In chapter 12, they listen and obey exactly what he says. And perhaps it is this element that has been added. First of all, the combinations of seeing these 7 wondrous plagues and God's firm hand in Egypt. But also, perhaps it is this added responsibility to transmit to the following generations that gives them the ability and the motivation to listen. Shabbat Shalom from Samaria.